Out on the edge of a snow-bitten western town, the kind of place where whispers travel faster than stagecoaches, a woman stood in the street clutching a wicker basket to her chest. Her shawl was thin against the wind, her hair whipped across her face, but her eyes, they didn't blink. She was past begging until the lawman took one step closer. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking, "don't take my baby." The sheriff, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of dust and disappointment, had heard pleas before. But something in the way she said, "my baby," slowed his hand. Still, duty was duty. He reached for the basket, and then froze. What he saw inside wasn't what the law or the gossips had told him. It wasn't what any man could have expected. And in that still, brittle moment between one breath and the next, both of their lives shifted. Who was this woman really, and what story was stitched into the lines on her face lines, carved by more than just age, but by winters without warmth and summers without kindness? The townsfolk only knew the rumor that she'd been sold young, abandoned older, and now carried something she had no right to claim. But rumors rarely told the truth. The sheriff had a choice: follow the letter of the law, or follow the pull in his chest, the one that whispered that maybe, just maybe, this woman wasn't a criminal at all, but the most honest soul he'd met in years. They said the frontier was a place for the strong, but here was a woman whose strength looked nothing like guns or fists. It was the quiet, stubborn kind that survives the unspeakable and still manages to keep a child warm in her arms. And yet danger was already coming. A man from her past, a man who believed people could be bought and kept, was riding toward town, papers in hand, ready to claim what he thought was his. If he reached her first, it wouldn't matter what the sheriff believed. In the stillness before the storm, the sheriff looked at her one last time, wondering, could he protect her from the law he swore to uphold? And if he did, what would it cost them both? Because sometimes the West didn't give you time to think. It gave you a heartbeat to decide, and the rest of your life to live with the choice. The wind came off the river with a chill that seemed older than the town itself. It combed through the reed beds, rattled the weathered shingles, and carried with it the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. Evening was lowering, pressing the day's gold into long, cold shadows. Eliza Hart walked in that fading light the way someone carries a secret, careful, measured guarding more than her hands could show. Near 50, she bore the marks of a life lived under both the sun's generosity and its merciless glare, silver at her temples, skin tanned and lined in ways no fine lady's cream could smooth away. There was a strength in her shoulders from years of work, but in her eyes a softness that made babies reach for her and unsettled those who mistook kindness for weakness. In her arms she carried a basket lined with a blue quilt, stitched so neatly it could only have been made for something or someone beloved. The edges were turned in, as if to keep the world out. Eliza knew hardship too well. She'd endured an arranged marriage that crumbled into humiliation, the loss of a child to fever, and the cruel stares of neighbors who thrived on other people's misfortunes. And yet she had never stopped choosing compassion, cooking for the sick, mending for strangers, humming hymns over calves too weak to stand. Tonight, though, she did not walk toward home. Her boots carried her over the low bridge toward the glow of the sheriff's office. Each step measured, each breath steady. The basket was not heavy, but its weight was of another kind entirely. Inside, under the quilt, something shifted. At the far end of Main Street, two ranch hands leaned against the saloon wall, the lamplight glinting off whiskey bottles. Evening, Miss Hart, one drawled, eyes flicking to the basket. "What you got there, a pie or maybe a cat?" The other elbowed him. "Let her be." Eliza said nothing, her silence carrying more dignity than any answer could. The river's murmur accompanied her low, steady, like an old friend who knows better than to ask questions. In the sheriff's office, Thomas Vale was bent over his desk, reading a complaint about hogs in a garden. A widower with kind eyes set in a weathered face, Vale had earned a reputation for fairness, firm when he had to be, but never cruel. He could break up a saloon fight or carry a wounded man 6 miles in the snow, and he did both without asking for thanks. When the door creaked open, he looked up. "Eliza," he said, standing. "It's late." She stepped inside, her voice quiet as the river. "Thomas, I need your help." His gaze fell to the basket. Mothers here wrapped their babies in brown or cream. This quilt, bright blue, mended with tiny, careful stitches, was different. Vale's brow furrowed. "What happened?" Eliza swallowed. "I need you to hear me out before you decide anything." He nodded slowly. You have my word. She lowered the basket onto his desk, loosening her grip as though each finger had to be convinced to let go. The quilt rustled, and just then the door behind her swung open hard enough to rattle the glass. Evelyn Dodd, the preacher's wife, stood there with two women from the church committee flanking her like guards. Their bonnets trembled with indignation. "We know what she's hiding," Sheriff Evelyn declared, "and it's time it was brought into the light." Vale straightened, jaw tightening. Eliza's hands remained on the basket, steady protective. Sheriff Vale's next glance inside that quilt would stop his heart, but not for the reason anyone in that room expected. For a long moment, the room held only the hum of the oil lamp and the faint creak of the sheriff's desk under the basket's weight. Sheriff Vale stepped forward, hands calm but eyes sharpened. "All right," he said evenly. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Evelyn Dodd folded her arms, the stiff lace at her cuffs scratching against her wrists. "You'll see. And when you do, you'll understand why this woman shouldn't be trusted around decent folk." Eliza didn't flinch. She simply bent, lifted the quilt's corner, with the gentleness of someone waking a child, and turned it back. Vale's breath caught. Inside was not a newborn's round face, but a boy perhaps 2 years old, fast asleep, his cheeks flushed from the warmth of the quilt. Curled against his side, one tiny fist clutched a tin horse no bigger than a thumb. His hair was the color of corn silk in August, and though his clothes were patched, they were clean. But that wasn't what stopped Vale cold. It was the child's eyes, or rather the one that opened drowsily under the lamplight. Deep set, a startling blue-gray, the exact shade of another set Vale had known long ago. He'd seen that color once before in the eyes of Daniel Mercer, a man buried 5 winters past under a headstone Vale himself had carved. "His name is Jonah," Eliza said softly, brushing a strand of hair from the boy's forehead. "And before you ask, no, I didn't steal him. I saved him." Evelyn's lips tightened. "From where? From his kin?" "Because last I checked, the Mercers." "The Mercers," Eliza cut in her voice like a blade wrapped in velvet, left him in a wagon outside Abner's Crossing. Alone. In the cold. "I found him before the wolves did." A murmur rippled between the church women. Vale's jaw shifted, his gaze fixed on Jonah, who was now blinking up at him with the sleepy trust of someone too young to understand danger. "Why bring him here, Eliza?" he asked quietly. She straightened her hands, resting protectively on the quilt. "Because I've heard the talk. Evelyn here already has the ladies ready to march to the judge and see him taken. I'm not letting them put him in some orphan train headed east where no one knows his name or where he came from." Evelyn's nostrils flared. "We're trying to place him in a God-fearing home." Eliza met her glare without blinking. "Then maybe you should have started by not throwing stones at the one roof that's already kept him warm." Vale's hand hovered over the desk, his mind working. "Eliza, you know harboring a child without declaring it to the county puts you in a bind." "I know," she replied. "But I also know what happens to little ones with no one to speak for them. And I'll stand in front of any man, judge, or preacher before I let him go through it." Jonah shifted, the tin horse clinking softly in his palm. Without opening both eyes, he murmured, "Mama." It was barely more than a breath, but it silenced the room. Evelyn stepped back as if struck. The church women exchanged uneasy glances. Vale, still staring at the boy, felt something move in his chest that he hadn't let stir in years. Memories of the war orphan his sister had once taken in. Memories of standing too late at too many graves. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "Nobody's taking him tonight. But in the morning." His gaze locked on Eliza. "We'll need to talk." Eliza's chin lifted. "Then I'll be here, and so will he." But morning in a small western town has a way of bringing more than sunlight. Sometimes it brings the past knocking, and it doesn't knock alone. Dawn in Willow Bend came pale and cold, the frost tracing silver veins along the hitching posts and the eaves of the sheriff's office. By the time the church bell struck 8, word had already spread. Eliza Harper was keeping a Mercer boy, and the sheriff was stalling the law. The murmurs were as constant as the wind. At the mercantile and the blacksmith shop by the stove at the saloon, folks leaned close and whispered about sin, disguised as charity, about women who couldn't be trusted, about how that Harper widow had always had trouble follow her like a shadow. Inside the sheriff's office, Eliza sat on a wooden bench. Jonah drowsy against her shoulder, the blue quilt wrapped around them both. She'd been awake all night, not because Jonah had fussed he hadn't, but because she knew the hours before sunrise often decided the battles that came after it. Sheriff Vale stood by the window watching Main Street. His coffee had gone cold untouched. "They're circling," he said quietly. "Let them," Eliza murmured. "I've lived through worse than words." Vale turned from the window, his jaw tight. Words have a way of becoming votes, and votes can take a child faster than any outlaw with a gun. Before she could answer, the sound of hooves broke through the street's morning hush, not the steady trot of a local rancher, but the hard, fast approach of someone with a purpose. Vale's eyes narrowed as a dark bay gelding came into view, steam puffing from its flanks. The rider swung down, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that made people step aside before they knew why. His coat was trail-dusted, his hat low over eyes, the color of a storm brewing far off. When he pushed open the office door, Eliza's back stiffened. Caleb Mercer, Daniel's cousin, and once, a lifetime ago, the man who had asked her to marry him before her father sold her to another. "Eliza," he said, voice slow, like he was tasting the years between them. "You're a long way from the girl who used to race me to the creek. And you're a long way from the man who swore he'd never ride into Willow Bend again," she replied. His gaze flicked to Jonah. "Looks like you've been keeping company with my blood." Vale stepped forward. "You here on personal business, Mercer?" Or legal? Caleb's jaw worked. "Both. My brother's dead. His son's been left without proper care. That makes him my responsibility by blood and by law." Eliza rose slowly, shifting Jonah so he stayed asleep. "Your responsibility?" Her voice was calm, but there was iron in it. Where was that responsibility when he was left freezing in a wagon? A muscle ticked in Caleb's cheek. "You don't know the whole story. Then tell me," she said, taking one step toward him, "because I was there. I saw the frost on his lips. I heard the wolves in the tree line." Caleb looked away for a moment, then back, his voice lower. "There's more at stake than you realize. Folks in this town won't protect you, Eliza. But I can. Let me take him, and you won't have to stand in that storm." She held his gaze. "I've been standing in storms my whole life, Caleb. The only difference now is I'm not standing alone." Vale's eyes moved between them, reading the quiet challenge in the air. Caleb was dangerous, but not in the way outlaws were. He was the kind of man who believed his claim was justified, and men like that rarely walked away empty-handed. From the bench, Jonah stirred the tin horse clinking in his small hand. His eyes blinked open, landing on Caleb, then on Eliza. And that was when he reached out, not to the man who shared his blood, but to the woman who had carried him through the cold. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with bullets, they're fought with the pull of blood against the pull of love. And in Willow Bend, one of those was about to be lost. By the following morning, it wasn't whispers anymore. It was a march. Not with banners or drums, but with the slow, deliberate steps of half the town gathering at the courthouse steps. The winter sky was flat and white, the air biting hard enough to chap lips. Eliza stood inside, hands clenched behind her back, while the murmur of voices seeped through the thin walls like smoke. Sheriff Vale poured coffee into a tin mug, handed it to her. "They've called for an emergency hearing," he said. "Council wants to discuss the matter of the Mercer child's welfare." She didn't drink. And who speaks for Jonah? Vale's gaze softened. "That's the trouble, Eliza. They think Caleb's already speaking for him." The door opened and Caleb stepped in, dust still on his boots from the ride over. He didn't tip his hat. "They're ready," he said. "I'm not," Eliza replied. He let out a dry laugh. "You think readiness matters? This is about law, and the law's on my side." Vale shifted his hand, resting casually on the butt of his sidearm. Not as a threat, but as a reminder, Caleb wasn't the only one with weight in the room. They moved to the council chamber. The benches were full, ranchers, merchants, women in their Sunday shawls, even though it wasn't Sunday. Judge Hollis sat behind the long table, spectacles perched low. "We'll hear statements," he said. "Mr. Mercer first." Caleb stood, hands loose at his side, speaking with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to hold a room. He painted himself as the wronged kin, the man riding in to claim what blood and duty demanded. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried the quiet authority of inheritance and old alliances. When it was Eliza's turn, she rose with Jonah still in her arms. Her voice was steady, but every eye in the room weighed on her like stones. "You all know what it is to lose," she began. "Some of you have buried wives, husbands, children. You know the cold that settles in your chest after. But none of you would leave what's left of your family to freeze alone on the prairie." A ripple went through the benches. She went on. "I didn't take Jonah from his blood. I took him from death, and I won't hand him back to it." Caleb's jaw tightened, but Judge Hollis raised a hand. "We'll recess for deliberation." Outside, snow began to fall, fine, sharp flakes that clung to coats and lashes. Vale stood beside Eliza under the overhang. "They're leaning his way," he said quietly. "I figured," she replied, eyes on the snow. "Men like Caleb rarely ride into town without riding out with what they came for." Vale looked at Jonah, then back at her. "So what's your play?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced her thumb along the edge of Jonah's quilt. "Sometimes you can't out-talk the storm," she said. "You just hold tight and pray your roots are deep enough." From across the street, Caleb watched them, and the look in his eyes said he wasn't leaving Willow Bend without the boy. "Some storms you can see coming. Others are already at your door. And for Eliza, this one might tear away the only good thing left in her world." That night, the snow deepened, blanketing Willow Bend in a brittle hush. The council would reconvene in 2 days. 2 days, that was all Eliza had before Judge Hollis could sign away her right to Jonah with a neat scratch of his pen. She sat at the small kitchen table in Sheriff Vale's quarters, Jonah asleep in the basket by the stove. The fire popped, and outside the wind curled around the eaves like an animal hunting for a way in. Vale leaned back in his chair, boots crossed. "If you stay the course, you'll lose," he said plainly. She didn't look at him. "I'm not letting him have the boy." "You're thinking like a mother," Vale said. "You need to think like a player." Eliza's eyes narrowed. "I've never played games in my life." "Then maybe it's time you learn." Vale explained what he'd seen over years as sheriff men like Caleb, who cared about control more than blood. If you take away the control, Vale said, you take away the fight. But you gotta do it in a way that shows the whole town what he really is. She frowned. "And how would I do that?" Vale slid a folded paper across the table, a land record. "Mercer Ranch is broke," he said. "Caleb's been using the livestock as collateral for gambling debts. If that gets out in the hearing, he'll lose credibility faster than a drunk preacher." Eliza's heart pounded. "You're telling me to use his ruin against him? I'm telling you to tell the truth, but in a place where truth stings hardest." She stared at the paper. This wasn't her way, using another person's weakness. But she thought of Jonah, his tiny fingers curling around hers in sleep. She thought of the way Caleb's eyes had skimmed over the boy like property. Finally, she said, "What do I need to do?" The next morning, she rode to the general store, the one place in town where every rumor had legs. She didn't speak of Jonah. She spoke of debt of cattle gone missing, of men in black coats coming to collect what Caleb couldn't pay. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. Her calm certainty made the story heavier than any shouted accusation. By the time she left, the whispers had already started. Vale met her at the hitching post outside. "You sure you're ready for the storm you just lit?" She pulled Jonah closer against the wind. "If I can't stop the storm, Sheriff, I can make sure it hits the right man first." Caleb thought he was the only one who knew how to play hard, but Eliza just put her first piece on the board, and the next move might cost him everything. The Willow Bend Council Hall was a squat wooden building with frost caked in the corners of the windows. Inside, the stove roared, but the air still felt cold, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature. Townsfolk had crowded in, their voices low, the scrape of boots on the plank floor, loud in the quiet. Eliza sat in the front row, Jonah in her lap, wrapped in the old knitted blanket she'd refused to replace. Sheriff Vale stood at the back, arms folded, watching the doors. They swung open, and Caleb Mercer stepped in clean-shaven, wearing a dark coat too fine for a man in debt. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Eliza. He smiled, slow, deliberate, as if the outcome was already written. Judge Hollis banged his gavel. "We're here to hear the matter of custody over the minor child, Jonah Mercer." Caleb stood. "Your Honor, the boy is my blood. His mother is unfit, alone, without means. The law is clear." Eliza felt the eyes on her, felt the weight of being measured and found wanting, but she didn't lower her gaze. Judge Hollis turned to her. "Mrs. Mercer, do you wish to respond?" She rose Jonah in her arms, her voice calm. I am alone, Your Honor, but I am not without means, and I am not without truth. She pulled a folded paper from her coat the land record Vale had given her. This is Mercer Ranch's debt ledger. Caleb has used livestock property and wages as collateral for gambling debts. If this is the example of a stable home, then perhaps stability needs a new definition. A murmur rippled through the room. Caleb's jaw tightened. That's a lie, he said sharply. Eliza's gaze didn't waver. Then show them your accounts. For the first time, Caleb didn't answer right away. The silence was louder than any denial. Judge Hollis leaned back, studying Caleb. Mr. Mercer, is this true? Caleb's mouth opened, but no sound came. In that moment, Eliza felt the room shift. The stares on her were no longer just judgment. Some carried respect, others a reluctant acknowledgement. But with it came something else, a realization that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. She hadn't just offended Jonah, she'd publicly humiliated the man who once held power over her. And in the Wild West, that kind of blow didn't heal without someone trying to strike back. Eliza may have just saved Jonah in the eyes of the council, but in doing so, she's given Caleb a new reason to come after her. And this time, he won't come with papers. The snow came in thick, wet flakes that clung to coats and lashes, muting every sound. The council had ruled in Eliza's favor. Jonah would remain in her care. But the relief didn't feel clean. It carried the weight of knowing Caleb wasn't finished. Sheriff Vale walked her out to the hitching post. His horse snorted in the cold. He won't try you in court again, Vale said quietly. Next time it'll be on his terms. Eliza adjusted Jonah's blanket. I've lived looking over my shoulder before, Sheriff, but I'm tired of running. Vale studied her for a long moment. Then don't run. He hesitated as if choosing each word. I've got room at my ranch. Plenty of work, a roof that doesn't leak. You'd be safe. It wasn't the first time a man had offered her a place to stay, but this time there was no bargain in the words, no ownership in the tone, just a quiet promise. They rode in near silence back toward the edge of town. The horizon was a watercolor of gray and gold, the snow lighting the world from the ground up. Jonah's head lolled against her shoulder, warm and trusting. When they reached Vale's ranch, the lamplight spilling from the windows felt like a welcome she hadn't dared hope for. He helped her down, his gloved hand lingering just a moment longer than needed. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and bread. Vale took Jonah so she could remove her coat. Watching the lawman, so steady, so careful, rock her boy without hesitation, something in her chest eased for the first time in years. She realized then that safety wasn't just the absence of danger, it was the presence of someone who would stand between you and the storm, even when it wasn't their fight. Eliza met Vale's eyes across the small, warm kitchen. We'll work for our keep, she said. His smile was small, but it reached his eyes. You're already worth more than you know. The wind rattled against the shutters, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt the future open, not as a road she must walk alone, but as one she might choose to share. Sometimes the West didn't give you the life you planned, but it could still give you the people you were meant to find. And for Eliza, that might just be enough to start again. Some endings don't arrive with trumpets or a crowd in the street. Sometimes they come as softly as snow on an empty prairie, silent, steady, and almost unnoticed until you feel the weight of it on your shoulders. For Eliza's safety didn't mean the world suddenly became kind. It meant there was one place and one person where she could lay down her burdens without fear they'd be used against her. For the sheriff, it wasn't about breaking the law. It was about bending it just enough to let mercy through the door. In a land that often rewarded the loudest voice they found, courage in quiet acts, bread left on a table, a fire kept burning through the night, a child's blanket folded at the foot of a bed. And maybe that's a lesson we can carry with us. Real strength is rarely about force. It's about the choice to protect, to forgive, to stand beside someone when the rest of the world turns away. If you've ever been through a long winter in your life, you know the power of a little warmth. Maybe you can be that warmth for someone else today. This has been another story from None, Wild West Saga. If you'd like more tales of resilience, late-blooming love, and the quiet victories that matter most, make sure you subscribe. Share this story and leave a comment below. Tell me, would you like to see what happens next for Eliza and the sheriff? Or hear more true-hearted stories like this one?